Hi, my name is Victoria and welcome to Eyes on Crime. I want to tell you about a case that begins like so many others. A young man says goodnight to his friends and heads home. The night is quiet. Nothing seems out of place, but something happens along the way. And by morning, everything's changed. This is the case of Brandon Swanson. To understand how a simple night took such a strange and unexpected turn, we have to go back to the beginning. Brandon Victor Swanson was born on January 30th, 1989 in Marshall, Minnesota. It's a quiet, close-knit town surrounded by farmland and windswept fields. Brandon was the only son of Brian and Annette Swanson. He had a younger sister, and from everything people say, he was a dependable, grounded young man who genuinely enjoyed being around his family. His parents trusted him, and with good reason. If he said he'd do something, you could count on it. Brandon was very mature and driven to be so young. At the age of 15, he started working part-time at Hy-Vee. In fact, he worked there for a total of 4 years of shifts, through high school and college. Those who were close to Brandon described him as someone who loved to read and had a strong interest in science, even from a young age. He liked trying to solve complex problems, and he was proud when he figured them out. That passion for science really shaped his future and guided his college decisions. After graduating from Marshall Senior High School in 2007, Brandon enrolled at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, where he was studying wind energy technology. That wasn't just a casual interest, he was genuinely excited about it. He liked the mechanics, the process, the promise of doing something useful. Spring had finally settled over southwest Minnesota. For most people, that meant open windows, longer days, and life getting back to normal after another long, cold winter. For Brandon, it marked the end of his first year at Minnesota West in Canby. Classes had just wrapped up, finals were done. That feeling, the one that comes with turning in your last assignment and knowing summer's just around the corner, it was right there, something you could feel and well earned. Brandon wasn't just excited about the start of summer. He'd been accepted to Iowa Western Community College, where he planned to transfer and continue studying something in the same technical field. This school was in Council Bluffs, Iowa, just under 5 hours away. So he'd be living on his own and experiencing more of the traditional college life. On the night of May 13th, 2008, he went to a small party, more like a laid-back get-together, at a house in Lind, Minnesota, about 8 miles from Marshall. He was there to celebrate with what was reported to be about 5 friends. Nothing wild, just a low-key night with close friends, hanging out and kicking off the start of summer. Witnesses said Brandon was having a good time, relaxed and social. There were a few mentions that he had one alcoholic drink, but when questioned later, everyone agreed. He wasn't visibly drunk or impaired. Of course, we're taking the word of people who had been drinking, so it's possible their judgment wasn't perfect either. Brandon wanted to see a friend before that friend left for college, so around 10:30 p.m. he headed to another get-together in Canby, about 30 miles away. The drive took around 45 minutes, so he likely arrived around 11:15. This gathering had a different vibe, bigger crowd, and reportedly a lot more alcohol. According to partygoers, Brandon is said to have taken 1 shot of whiskey, but he didn't stay long. Around midnight, he says his goodbyes, got into his car, a Chevy Lumina, and starts the drive home to Marshall. It wasn't an unfamiliar route. He'd made that trip nearly every day as part of his commute to and from school. But that night, instead of taking Minnesota State Highway 68, the most direct route between Canby and Marshall, Brandon chose to drive through rural farming roads. Some believe he chose the back roads to avoid police, since he'd had a drink earlier. And with the school year just ending, officers were likely more vigilant, watching for underage drinking or late-night driving. It's possible Brandon took the back roads to avoid a routine traffic stop. And this isn't to suggest that he drank a lot, but we have to remember that Brandon was definitely underage. There have been reports that he had gotten a DUI before and just had a 1-year probation, so it would make sense that he wanted to avoid any chances of getting into trouble again. The route he took was rural, mostly flat, with long stretches of gravel road. He drove something called a stair-step pattern, north, then east, then north again. The roads were pitch black. His headlights were the only thing lighting the way. If he wasn't familiar with these roads, it would have been challenging to navigate, and complicating things even further, Brandon was legally blind in his left eye, which could have affected his depth perception while driving. During his drive, Brandon turned onto a narrow field road, just a strip of dirt and grass cutting between two crop fields. Since it was May, the crops hadn't grown in yet, so the land around him would have felt wide open and empty. No trees, no traffic, just a stretch of open farmland under a dark sky. Out there, it's easy to feel like you're the only person for miles, and he likely was. At about 1:15 a.m., as Brandon was turning from a field road back onto a gravel one, he misjudged the angle and slid off. Some people say he drove into a ditch, but that doesn't quite capture what actually happened. It had rained recently, and the gravel road was slick and muddy. His car didn't crash or flip, it just slid off into a steep, muddy patch just off the edge of a field approach. His tires couldn't get enough traction to pull back onto the road. Lincoln County Sheriff Jack Vizecki explained it this way. It's sort of a sharp incline, nothing major, but enough that the car would get hung up, so the wheels are too high off the ground to gain traction. For the next 30 minutes or so, Brandon tried to get the car moving, reverse, forward, rocking the wheel, but the Lumina wasn't going anywhere. It was stuck. He didn't call 911 or for roadside assistance. He didn't even call his parents right away. Before calling his parents, Brandon tried reaching out to a few friends, probably the ones he'd been with earlier that night, but no one picked up. So at 1:54 a.m., Brandon finally called his parents to ask for help. According to Brandon's dad, Brandon Swanson, there wasn't any panic in his voice. He wasn't shouting or rambling. He didn't sound confused or disoriented, and he wasn't slurring. He was calm, clear-headed, and focused, just trying to solve a problem. He told his father that he'd driven off the road and was stuck in a ditch, but he wasn't hurt. The car wasn't damaged. He just needed a hand getting out. He told his parents he was near Lind, near a golf course on a gravel road that runs between Lind and his hometown of Marshall. Brandon said he could see lights in the distance, maybe from town, maybe just a nearby house. Lynn was just a few minutes from Marshall. It was a small town they knew well, with familiar roads and landmarks. Brian didn't hesitate. He and Annette immediately got in the truck and drove toward Lynn, and the whole time they stayed on the phone. Once they arrived at the location where Brandon said he was, they couldn't see him, and he couldn't see his parents. So Annette suggested they flash their headlights, hoping it would help them spot each other. With no other cars around and no streetlights on that dark back road, the flashes should have lit up the area just enough to be seen. Brandon flicked his headlights on and off. They could hear the clicks through the phone, but it didn't help. There was no movement, no lights in the distance, no sign of him. Tempers flared in the early hours as frustrations grew. "Don't you see me?" Swanson asked as both he and his parents flashed their car headlights to signify their presence, CNN reported. While they were still on the phone, Brandon and his mom, Annette, got into an argument. Frustrated with the situation, he hung up on his mom. Very soon after, at 2:17 a.m., Annette called him back to apologize. That's when Brandon told them he'd just walk back to his friend's house in Lind. Since it was so late and Lynn wasn't far, Brian decided to swing by their house and let Annette get some rest. So he dropped her off at home and kept driving toward Lind, still on the phone with Brandon the entire time. They agreed to meet at the Linwood Tavern, a local bar. They were both very familiar with it and figured it would be the easiest place to meet. At this point, it was about 2:23 a.m., and they had been on the phone the entire time. Brandon still believed he was walking toward Lind, but told his dad that if he stayed on the gravel road, it would take too long. He was likely tired, cold, frustrated, and just ready to be done with the night. So, to save time, he decided to cut across a field as a shortcut. He described everything to his dad, what he was seeing, and the terrain around him as he tried to make his way back. He came across several fences along the way, and at one point told his dad how annoyed he was about having to climb over one more. Brian was listening closely. Driving slowly through the dark, scanning every road, every ditch, every field, trying to figure out where Brandon might be. He was concerned, of course, but also reassured. Brandon wasn't hurt. He wasn't panicked. He was still on the phone, talking to him every step of the way. That connection gave Brian a sense of control. It felt like Brandon was close, like he was just around the next bend or waiting at the end of the road, like it was only a matter of time before he'd be in the truck and they'd both be headed home. By around 3:10 a.m., Brandon had been on the phone with his dad for 47 minutes. Brian kept talking to him, trying to help, even though he had no idea where Brandon actually was or which direction he was heading. And then, right in the middle of the call, Brandon's tone changed. He shouted 2 words. "Oh, shit." And then, nothing. Silence. Brian started calling his name over and over again into the phone. No answer. He stayed on the line, listening, waiting, still nothing. He was hoping for something. A sound. A word. Anything. But when there was still nothing, he hung up. Brian tried calling back. Right away, then again, and again. The phone rang, but Brandon didn't pick up, and for a while it rang. It didn't go straight to voicemail. It rang 4, maybe 5 times that day, like the phone was still on. Annette said she tried several times too. They were hoping that even if his phone was on silent, that once the phone lit up, it would catch his attention and he would answer. Maybe he'd dropped it. Maybe he could still see the glow in the dark. Maybe he'd hear it ringing. But he didn't. Unsure of what else to do, Brandon's parents started calling his friends, hoping someone had seen him, heard from him, or might help look. A few friends joined the search that night without hesitation. Together, they spent hours driving the back roads near Highway 68, calling out his name, hoping he'd hear them and respond. They kept trying his phone over and over, just praying he'd pick up. The weather was clear, with a full moon lighting the fields. It was 46 degrees that night, and over the next few hours, the temperature dropped as low as 39. By then, people were starting to worry, not just because they couldn't find him, but because of what he was wearing. Brandon was about 5'6" and 120 pounds, with brown hair, blue eyes, and glasses. He had a stud in each ear and was wearing a white t-shirt under a blue striped polo shirt, baggy blue jeans, a black zip-up hoodie with an emblem on the back, and white sneakers. He also wore a white, flat Minnesota Twins baseball cap and a silver necklace. Not exactly gear for walking miles through cold, wet farmland. If he was still out there, it was getting cold fast. For several hours, Annette and Brian stayed in the area, driving gravel roads, looking for any sign of Brandon or his car. They circled Lynn, thinking maybe, somehow, he'd spot something they missed in the dark. But as hard as they were trying and searching, no one could find him or his car. Once the sun was up and there was still no sign of Brandon, his parents knew they needed serious help. At exactly 6:30 a.m., Annette called the Lynn Police Department to report Brandon missing and file a missing persons report. She told the officer that his dad had been on the phone with Brandon when the call suddenly went silent, that he'd sounded fine, and then something changed, that they'd spent the whole night searching but couldn't find him and he never came home. But law enforcement's response didn't reflect the urgency she felt. It was just the kind of typical response too many others have gotten over the years. He reminded her that Brandon was 19, and he said this wouldn't be the first time a college kid drank a little, spent the night at a friend's house, and didn't go home. Then he said something she'd never forget. It's his right to be missing. Annette didn't buy it. Brandon wasn't out partying or hanging out with friends. He'd asked for help. He wanted to come home. And then, mid-sentence, he disappeared. She knew something was terribly wrong. She wouldn't let it go. So eventually the Lynn Police Department put out a notice for officers to be on the lookout, and they took the first real step in the investigation. They pulled Brandon's cell phone records. Brandon had been adamant that he was near Lynn, close to Highway 23, but the cell phone data didn't back that up. The phone records told a completely different story. He hadn't been near Lynn at all. His last known location was near Minneota, closer to Taunton and Porter. Suddenly, all the confusion from the night before, the missing headlights, the landmarks that didn't match, it finally made sense. He'd been in the wrong place the whole time. He never had a chance of finding Brandon. Not that night. Not there. More specifically, the call had routed through a tower at the intersection of County Roads 3 and 10, just outside of Minneota. An isolated stretch of rural land. That meant he wasn't near Lynn at all. He was closer to Taunton and Porter, almost 25 miles away. That signal was eventually narrowed to a 5-mile radius, which finally gave search teams a place to focus. Soon after that, the case shifted. The Lynn police reached out to the Lyon County Sheriff's Department for help, and the search moved west out toward Taunton and Porter based on where Brandon's phone had last pinged. That's when Sheriff David Dahl stepped in, and with his team, the search became more organized. They began combing the gravel roads and farmland extensively, covering every stretch between the small towns and open fields. And eventually, their work paid off. Brandon's Chevy Lumina was discovered about a mile north of Highway 68 near the Lincoln County line and roughly a mile from Taunton. Just stuck, hung up on a shallow embankment where a narrow field approach met a gravel road. The kind of road meant for farm equipment and irrigation trucks, not late-night driving. It was a minimum maintenance road, unlit, unmarked, and surrounded by open fields. A place so remote that even in daylight you could drive past it without a second glance. The car wasn't damaged at all, not even a scratch, but it was stuck. Some of the tires weren't touching the ground, and without enough traction, Brandon couldn't move. There were no skid marks, no blood, no broken glass, no tire tracks, no signs of a struggle, and inside the car, nothing. No wallet, no phone, no keys, and no glasses. Just the car, abandoned, alone. Where was Brandon? While they were out searching and trying to figure out which direction Brandon might have walked, Sheriff Dahl noticed a red light coming from the Porter grain elevator. He suggested that Brandon may have mistaken it for the blinking lights on a building in Lind, an easy mistake to make in the dark, where distant lights can seem much closer than they really are. As daylight faded and there were no leads, Sheriff Dahl reached out for additional support. He brought in the Codington County Search and Rescue Dive Team to assist with the search, mainly for the use of search dogs. So on May 15th, just 2 days after Brandon disappeared, the search officially expanded. Specialized K-9 units were brought in, bloodhounds trained to track human scent across rural terrain like this. Deputies on horseback and ATVs were also brought in to help cover the rougher areas, fields, ditches, and wooded patches that couldn't be easily searched by foot or vehicle. At first, handlers tried using Brandon's vehicle to establish a scent trail, but the dogs didn't pick up any scent from the car at all. So instead, they were given clothing from his home, and that worked. The trail began heading south for about half a mile, then veered west onto another street. It continued along that road for roughly a mile before turning north onto County Road 16. From there, the trail followed another half mile before turning west again, this time leading into the driveway of an abandoned barn. The dog continued tracking Brandon's scent for about a quarter mile farther, eventually cutting northwest along the Yellow Medicine River. At one point along the riverbank, the dog jumped into the water. That sudden movement led many to wonder if Brandon had fallen in, but just as quickly the dog climbed back out and kept going, never losing the trail. The scent led search crews to a river drainage area, then curved north, following a gravel road that served as the dividing line between Lincoln County and Yellow Medicine County. And that's where the trail abruptly ended. There's one detail that stands out here. That particular gravel road had been freshly regraded earlier that morning. Many believe that's what disrupted the scent, scraping away any remaining trace and making it impossible for the dog to continue tracking. But some searchers believe the grader didn't just erase the scent, it may have wiped away other clues too. Footprints, tire tracks, even something more. On the call, Brandon mentioned crossing 2 fences and hearing rushing water, and the bloodhound followed a path that matched. To his parents, it felt like confirmation the dog was on his exact trail. While the dogs worked the river's edge, other teams kept moving through the area, checking everything they could. A helicopter circled overhead, scanning the fields and tree lines from above. It was May, so the fields were still bare, just short crops and dirt. In a place that open, it should have been easy to see someone. Emergency personnel and volunteers from the community walked the land, pushing farther out from where Brandon's car had been found, hoping for anything. A trail, a piece of clothing, some kind of clue. Meanwhile, a boat crew from the Department of Natural Resources searched the nearby river, eyes scanning the surface, watching for any trace of him. Over the next several days, and then weeks, the search began to slow. Fewer people came out, fewer calls came in, but Sheriff Jack Vizecki, the lead investigator from Lincoln County, never stepped back. He personally walked 2 miles of the riverbank every single day for the next 30 days. He wasn't just delegating, he was searching, watching, and hoping to find something, anything, that might lead them to Brandon. It's officially called the Yellow Medicine River, but to locals it usually feels more like a creek. Narrow, shallow, and easy to cross most of the year, but that spring, with snowmelt coming down and recent rain, the water was unusually high. Law enforcement said it can rise as much as 10 feet in places like that, making it deeper and faster than it looks. In late 2008, Emergency Support Services, a search and rescue organization based in Minneapolis, identified a 140 square mile area and focused their efforts there. But progress was slow. Some farmers refused to allow search canines onto their land, especially during planting and harvest season. That left significant gaps, entire stretches of land that couldn't be covered. And the issue still persists today, not because people have stopped searching, but because they're still being told no. With no body, no belongings, and no conclusive trail, theories started to build, some more plausible than others. But each one, in its own way, reflects the sheer strangeness of what happened that night. The drowning theory. One of the most widely discussed explanations is the simplest, that Brandon slipped, fell into the Yellow Medicine River, and drowned. The area had seen heavy flooding that spring. Parts of the river were high, the current faster than usual. If he lost his footing near the bank, it's possible he was swept away. But there's one detail that casts doubt. The scent trail didn't stop at the water. It kept going, across the river and up the opposite bank. That strongly suggests Brandon made it across. At least once. And if he did, it raises a question. Why would he go back? Annette Swanson has been clear. She doesn't believe her son drowned. There really is nothing to indicate that he's in the river, she said in one interview. Sheriff Jack Vizecki, who led the original search, agreed. He described the scent trail as unusually strong, and while he didn't rule anything out, he also said someone could have been in the shadows. The river was searched over and over, by foot, by boat, with dogs, sonar, drags, and divers. Every spring, crews went back to the same stretch of water, and still nothing. It wasn't until after the fall harvest, when more fields were cleared, that search teams were finally able to return and cover some of that ground. But by then, months had passed, and even now, some landowners still say no. Over the years, cadaver dogs have picked up scents and alerted to the possible presence of human remains near Brandon's last known location, including areas around the Yellow Medicine River and Mud Creek. However, law enforcement has never publicly confirmed the exact locations of these alerts or definitively linked the scent to Brandon. Hypothermia. Some believe Brandon may have succumbed to the cold. That night, temperatures dropped into the high 30s, cold enough to be dangerous, especially if he'd gotten wet. Even damp clothing from crossing a river or walking through wet spots in the field would have made it harder to stay warm. In those conditions, hypothermia can set in fast. He was likely exhausted and frustrated from walking so far and getting nowhere. So he could have stopped to rest and the cold overtook him before he realized what was happening. It's possible. The risk was there. But without a body, there's no way to know for sure. Farm equipment. There's also the possibility that Brandon made it across the river and kept walking. Maybe he got too cold. Maybe he was exhausted. Maybe he sat down to rest in a field and no one saw him in time. Farmers in this part of Minnesota sometimes run heavy machinery late at night. Large equipment, guided by GPS, moving through wide fields without always relying on headlights. If Brandon had been lying down, especially during planting season, it's hard to say whether a driver would have seen him. Some cadaver dogs did alert near certain pieces of farm equipment, but not every landowner allowed searches. And that's been one of the biggest challenges in this case. Not just for this theory, but for all of them. Accident. There's also the possibility that Brandon had some kind of accident. Maybe he fell into something like a well, a cistern, or even an old abandoned structure out in the field. His dad would later say that just before the silence, it sounded like Brandon's foot might have slipped. But how he knew that, or what the sound actually was, it's almost impossible to say. Maybe Brandon did fall, or maybe it was something more ordinary, just a stumble in the dark. We really don't know. That part of Minnesota has a number of old farmsteads and abandoned outbuildings, some barely standing, some filled with rusted equipment or loose floorboards. If Brandon was looking for shelter or just a place to get his bearings, he could have stepped inside and gotten hurt or trapped without anyone knowing. And because many of those buildings sit on private land, they haven't all been thoroughly searched even now. Hit and run. Could Brandon have been hit by a passing vehicle while walking? Maybe. On rural roads, especially late at night, drivers don't expect to see someone on foot. But investigators found no signs of a collision, no blood, no debris, no tire marks suggesting a sudden stop or swerve. There was nothing to indicate a crash and nothing left behind to follow. Without physical evidence, it's hard to say what happened, and that's led some to wonder if this was more than an accident. Foul play. There's also speculation that Brandon may have encountered someone that night. Maybe a stranger met him on the gravel road and offered him a ride, or maybe it was someone he knew and something went wrong. Sheriff Vizecki has publicly stated that foul play couldn't be ruled out. Someone could have been in the shadows, he said. It only takes a minute. But there's no evidence, no witnesses, no signs of a struggle, no reports of suspicious vehicles in the area that night. And Brandon didn't seem alarmed on the phone. He may have been frustrated, but according to Brandon Swanson, he never sounded scared and he never sounded lost. He was not confused, Brian said. He knew what he was doing. Voluntary disappearance. Could he have staged it all? Walked away on purpose? Some have speculated that Brandon may have intentionally misled his parents about his location, but no one knows for sure, and there's no evidence that he had any reason to disappear. But his family is certain that's not what happened. He had plans, school, a new college, and a future he was genuinely excited about. He called his parents. He stayed on the phone for nearly an hour. He didn't sound like someone disappearing. He sounded like someone trying to be found. Annette said that when she learned how the call ended, she knew something was wrong. This wasn't something he would have done by choice. Investigators have said the most plausible scenarios include drowning, foul play, or Brandon misjudging his location in the dark, and then either getting lost, overwhelmed by the elements, or encountering something no one could have predicted. Other ideas like a hit and run or voluntary disappearance have been considered, but there's no solid evidence to support them. But in the weeks that followed, as the search slowed and the adrenaline wore off, Brandon's parents had time to really think about how things were handled, and they came to a devastating realization that things hadn't been taken seriously when it mattered most. In those early hours and days, there was confusion over who was in charge. 3 counties, Lyon, Lincoln, and Yellow Medicine, were all involved, and it wasn't immediately clear which agency should take the lead. That overlapping geography caused delays, and it became a major issue in the case. But what haunted them even more was how it all started. When they first called the police that morning, desperate for help, they were met with a shrug. Officers reminded them that Brandon was 19, legally an adult, and said it wasn't uncommon for college kids to spend the night with friends or not come home right away. There was no urgency, no immediate effort to search, just the implication that he'd turn up when he felt like it. The delay in opening the search wasn't about resources, it was red tape. Yes, Brandon was legally an adult, but emotionally, logically, he was still their son. He'd called for help, and then he vanished mid-sentence. That experience, that wall they hit when time mattered most, turned into something lasting. It became the driving force behind Brandon's Law. Brandon's Law, passed in 2009, rewrote the rules. It changed the language from missing child to missing person and required police to begin investigating immediately when someone under 21 is reported missing under dangerous or suspicious circumstances. The bill didn't pass easily. Lawmakers had concerns about privacy, about the use of cell phone pings, about what kinds of cases would qualify. When can they ping you and when can't they? One legislator asked during the hearings. Representative Marty Seifert, who carried the bill, said Annette Swanson's persistence was what pushed it through. She knew it wouldn't help her son, he said, but it could help others. Governor Tim Pawlenty signed Brandon's Law in May 2009 with the Swansons standing beside him. The law officially took effect in July of that year. Seifert later called it one of the most important bills of his career, and he kept the pen Governor Pawlenty used to sign it. The law clarified that police can't refuse to investigate just because the person hasn't been gone long. They might have left voluntarily. There's no immediate evidence of a crime. Or because the person reporting isn't family. Since then, at least 4 other states have passed similar laws. Brandon's disappearance became the catalyst for something bigger, something that's already helped other families avoid the delays the Swansons faced. That law's part of his legacy now. So are the people who keep searching, volunteers, K-9 units and their handlers, and farmers who go out of their way to double-check their land every planting season. Search teams who mark grids and comb fields 1 acre at a time. Some have been doing it for years, and after all this time, there's still just silence. No answers, no sign of him. Where is Brandon? Where's his phone, his hat, his necklace? How can someone vanish in the middle of wide, empty farmland? If Brandon is out there, if somehow, against all odds, he's still alive, Brandon's family wants him to know he's not forgotten. And if he's not, they want someone to help bring him home. By 2010, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, or BCA, officially became the lead agency on the case. They opened a dedicated tip line, and by 2015, it had received just over 90 separate leads. For a case with national attention, that number is shockingly low. If you know anything about what happened to Brandon Swanson, anything at all, please contact the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office or the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Even the smallest detail could make a difference, because someone out there knows something, someone saw something, and silence shouldn't be what this family is left with. Brandon wasn't just a missing person, he was a son, a friend, a kid with a future, and the people who love him have waited long enough. Brandon's family has never stopped searching. They've kept a porch light on for Brandon to see, not just in those early days, but every single night since May 14th, 2008. It's still on. Thank you for watching Eyes on Crime. If you'd like to see more cases like this, please consider subscribing and don't forget to tap the notification bell so you don't miss the next one.